My name is Dove and Reth, and on the afternoon I am going to tell you about, I was 40 years old and 4 years into a compact cultural exchange posting on Velaroth Prime. I was a credentialed attaché, grade 3, which is the grade where they send you to places that have a culture worth studying, and not enough political weight to warrant a grade 2 officer. I had spent those 4 years writing reports nobody read, attending dinners nobody photographed, and walking the long stone corridors of the Velaroth capital, noting which kinds of carved frieze appeared above which kinds of door. I did this because my younger sister Ian was an architectural historian back on Earth, and on every posting I had taken since she was 21, I had photographed and sketched the lintels and the column capitals and the corbel detail, and sent them to her with my notes. It was the one personal habit I kept that nobody at the office ever asked about. They saw me with my notepad in corridors and assumed I was writing my reports. I never corrected them. I came to the Velaroth Sovereign Palace that afternoon for routine credentials renewal. Every 4 years, a cultural exchange attaché had to present himself to the Chamberlain's office, sign a continuation document, and be formally recredentialed for a further posting. I had submitted the paperwork weeks earlier. The appointment was a formality. I expected to be in and out in 40 minutes. It was a clear afternoon. The Velaroth Prime sky in the warm months is the color of pale violet, deepening toward sunset, and the palace stone, quarried from the deep mineral basins to the south, picks up that color in long sheets along the western faces. The palace is not, as I have heard people imagine, a single building. It is a complex of 7 connected halls and 3 courtyards arranged in a long crescent against the foothills, and the formal receiving wing is at the southern end, where the sunlight angles into the antechambers from the high clerestory windows. I had been there twice before for ceremonial events. I knew the way. The Chamberlain's office sent me, on arrival, to wait in the southern antechamber. The southern antechamber is a long room with stone benches running along 3 of the 4 walls, and a vaulted ceiling carved with the Velaroth waterleaf motif, which is the oldest of their carved motifs, and the one Ian had specifically asked me to photograph at some point. I made a note to do it on my way out. I sat down on the bench along the eastern wall, took out my small spiral notepad, the same one I had carried since the posting before this one, and waited. I was not in a hurry. It was perhaps 10 minutes before I realized there was another person in the room. She was sitting on the bench along the southern wall, which placed her at about a 45-degree angle from me across the floor. She was very small. I would later learn she was 5 years old by Velaroth reckoning, which is approximately equivalent to a human 4.5. She had dark, close-cropped hair and skin in the deep indigo-violet range that runs through the older Velaroth lineages, a tone the textbooks describe as the color of the Velmersh Basin at twilight, which I had been to once on a survey trip, and which I can confirm is exactly that color. She wore a small formal robe in dark gray with no court insignia, and a pair of soft palace shoes. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was holding a small slate of the kind the Velaroth use for children's writing practice, a flat piece of dark stone with a mineral chalk in a loop. She was not writing. She was looking at the floor. I watched her for perhaps 30 seconds before I returned my attention to my notepad. She did not, as far as I could tell, look at me. I knew, from 4 years of paying attention, that the Velaroth do not encourage adult contact with royal children outside formal contexts. I knew also, from a paragraph in the briefing materials I had read on my first arrival, that the Queen's only child, Princess Ilivith, was reported to be in a state of formal grief following the death of her father in a survey accident 2 years ago, and was not appearing publicly. I knew this in the way one knows hundreds of facts about a posting one has been at for 4 years. I knew it without it being present in my mind. I did not look at the child on the bench and think, this is Princess Ilivith. I thought, this is a small girl who has been left here alone, probably by an attendant who stepped out to handle something, and she will be retrieved shortly, and I should not stare. I went back to writing about the corbel detail above the eastern doorway. I made notes for perhaps another 12 minutes. The light from the high windows shifted slightly across the floor. The child did not move. At one point I heard her small breath catch, a kind of half sigh, and I did not look up. I made a note about the proportions of the eastern lintel relative to the doorway width and underlined it because Ian had once said the Velaroth proportions broke a rule she had spent a year writing about. Then I heard footsteps and two voices in the corridor outside, and the heavy door at the western end of the antechamber opened, and two men came in. The first was a compact junior officer. I knew him by name. His name was Tarl Vesh, and he had been the office's junior procurement clerk for 18 months, a competent kid who did not yet know how much of his job was knowing when to be quiet. The second was a Velaroth advisor I knew by sight but not by name. He was a tall man in the deep blue of the Velaroth High Council, with the four-pointed insignia of a senior advisor at his collar, and he was in the middle of a sentence as the door opened. The entire framework of cultural exchange documentation is being reevaluated at this very moment. And frankly, the prior procedural framework is going to be replaced before any of these renewal credentials are processed under it, which I would have thought your office would have communicated to you before sending you over here today. Tarl Vesh said something I could not quite hear. The advisor's voice rose. If you would simply move the conversation to a private space, perhaps we could resolve this in a manner that does not waste either of our afternoons. I have asked already. I am asking again. There is a fundamental difficulty in conducting confidential framework consultations in a public antechamber. His eyes went briefly to the child on the southern bench. I saw the look. It was the look of a man who had registered the presence of a young royal in his peripheral vision and had decided to use it as ambient pressure rather than to acknowledge it. I had seen that look on 100 faces in 4 years, and I had stopped being able to make my own face do the thing it does when I see it. The child curled smaller on the bench. Her hands had gone tighter in her lap. Her eyes were on the floor still. I closed my notepad slowly. I set my pencil down on the bench beside me. I did not stand. I did not raise my voice. I said in plain compact standard, the most ordinary register I could manage. Excuse me, advisor. If the conversation concerns confidential framework matters, the corridor outside has a bench at the far end that is well placed for it. I'd be happy to wait the additional minute or two until you are finished there. The advisor turned to look at me. I do not think he had seen me before that moment. I am a man people do not notice on benches. I am 40 years old, of average height and average build, with graying hair and a face that has been described to me by my mother and my sister as kind, in a way that does not announce itself, which is a thing they say to soften their assessment that it is not a face anyone remembers. I was wearing the compact dress uniform, gray, with the Cultural Exchange Office's small ivory pin at the collar. I held the advisor's eyes for perhaps 4 seconds. I did not smile. I did not look at the child. I waited. The advisor opened his mouth. I do not know what he had intended to say. He closed it. He looked at Tarl Vesh. He said, "Yes, that would be yes." Tarl Vesh, to his credit, said nothing. The two of them went out through the door at the western end of the antechamber, and it closed behind them with the heavy soft sound the Velaroth doors make. The antechamber was quiet again. I picked up my pencil. I opened my notepad. I went back to writing about the corbel detail. I did not look at the child. I had not, I realized after a moment, looked at her once during the exchange. I had not wanted her to feel that I was using her presence to win a small disagreement with a Velaroth advisor. I had wanted the disagreement to be about the corridor, which it had been, and I had wanted her bench to be her bench, undisturbed. I made notes for perhaps 3 more minutes. Then I heard a small scraping sound, the soft sound of soft palace shoes on the stone floor, and I looked up, because the sound was closer than it had been and the child had moved. She had slid along the bench, around the corner where the southern and eastern walls met, and was now sitting on the eastern bench at the far end from me, perhaps 8 meters distant. Her hands were still folded in her lap. Her slate was beside her on the bench. She was still looking at the floor. I returned to my notepad. I made no acknowledgement. I did not adjust my posture. I did not put the notepad down. I did not, in any way I could prevent, change my register. About 4 minutes later I heard the soft sound again, and when I next looked up without meaning to, in the natural course of looking from the doorway to the page, she had moved another 2 meters closer along the bench. She was now perhaps 6 meters from me. Her slate was in her lap. The mineral chalk was in her hand. She was drawing. I went back to writing. We sat that way, the child and I, for perhaps 20 minutes. She drew on her slate. I made notes about the antechamber's proportions and the relationship between the carved frieze and the line of the vault. The light through the high windows shifted by perhaps the width of a hand across the stone floor. At one point, I noted it without looking at her. She made a small humming sound, very quiet. That was not a tune but the half-tune children make when they are drawing something they are concentrating on. The sound stopped after a few seconds. I made a note about the eastern doorway's transom and underlined the word transom, because Ian had once spent an entire dinner explaining to me why transoms were the most underrated element of formal architecture. Then I felt in my peripheral vision that the child had stood up. I did not look. She walked 4 steps toward me along the eastern bench. She stopped. She was perhaps 3 meters from me. I heard her small breath. I heard the soft sound of palace shoes shifting on stone. I looked up. She was holding her slate out toward me. It was held with both small hands, the way children hold things they have decided to show to someone. She was not smiling. Her face was very serious. Her eyes were very large. They were the dark Velaroth eyes, and in the light from the high windows there was the faintest violet shimmer along the iris rim that the textbooks describe, and that I had seen in 4 years, perhaps 3 times in the right kind of light. I looked at the slate. She had drawn in the mineral chalk a vertical line. The line was very long, very straight, going from the top of the slate to the bottom. It was the deep violet color the mineral chalk produces against the dark stone. On the right side of the line, 2/3 of the way down, she had drawn a small figure, a stick figure, very small, the way a child of 4½ will draw a person. The figure had no face. It had 2 arms. One of the arms was raised as if holding something. There was a small rectangle near the raised arm. The rectangle had wavy lines coming off it. I looked at it for a moment. I said in Velaroth, in the plain low register one uses with a young child, "That's a very fine drawing. What is it?" She did not answer. I waited. I did not press. I said, "Is it a place?" She nodded, a very small nod, the kind a child gives when she is not sure she is allowed to nod. I said, "It's a deep place. The line goes down a long way." She nodded again. I said, "And there is a person there." She nodded a 3rd time. She was looking at the slate, not at me. I said, "What is the person doing?" She did not answer. She held the slate a little higher, the way a child does when she wants someone to look more carefully at a part of the drawing they have not yet looked at. I looked at the rectangle with the wavy lines. I said, "Is the person writing or drawing something?" She nodded very small twice. The second nod was the one that meant yes. I looked at the figure. I looked at the rectangle. I looked at the wavy lines. The figure was holding something flat, and there were lines coming off the flat thing. The way you draw heat lines or steam, or, I realized, the way a small child draws a person sketching, the wavy lines being the marks of the pencil on the paper, the rectangle being the paper itself. I said, "Is the person drawing?" She nodded. Then she did something I did not understand at that moment but would understand later. She lifted her small finger from the slate, and she pointed not at me, at my own notepad, which was open on my knee. I looked at the notepad. Then I looked at the slate, then I looked at her. I said very quietly in Velaroth, "He was drawing, like I was drawing." She nodded. Her eyes were very wet now, but she was not crying. She did not move. She held the slate up. She waited. I had no idea what to say. I'm not a man who improvises in situations that I do not have a procedural framework for. But I had 4 years of paying attention to small things, and I had a sister, and I had a niece her age back home, and I knew that what a child wants in a moment like that is not for the adult to perform sympathy or to ask probing questions. What a child wants is to be seen exactly as she is, holding exactly the thing she is holding, on exactly the bench she is on. I said, "Thank you for showing me. It is a very good drawing." She did not move. I said after a moment, "Would you like to sit a little closer?" She nodded once. She came and sat on the eastern bench at a distance of perhaps a meter from me. She held the slate in her lap. I returned to my notepad. We sat that way for perhaps 3 more minutes. I do not know what she was thinking. I made another note about the transom. I underlined transom a second time. Then the door at the western end of the antechamber opened and an attendant came in, a thin Velaroth woman in dark blue with the Chamberlain's office insignia at her sleeve, and she said, in a tone of suppressed urgency, "Princess, the court session is beginning. You are required." The child looked up at her. Then the child looked at me. Then she stood, very small, and walked across the floor to the attendant and took her hand. The attendant looked at me. She said, "Officer Reth, your renewal has been moved into the court session. The Chamberlain requests you attend." She was, I could see now, slightly panicked. Something had changed. I did not know what. I closed my notepad. I put my pencil in my breast pocket. I stood up. I said, "Of course." The child looked back at me as she was led to the door. Her face was very serious. I followed. The Hall of Witnessing is the formal chamber where the Velaroth court conducts proceedings that require sovereign presence and the witnessing of the heir. It is at the center of the palace complex, accessed by a long corridor lined with the family annals on one wall and the deep violet stone of the southern quarries on the other. I had never been in it. Cultural exchange attachés are not invited to the Hall of Witnessing. The Chamberlain's office, where I had expected my appointment, is 2 corridors east of it. The Chamberlain's attendant, walking briskly ahead of me with the child's small hand in hers, led me down the long corridor at a pace that did not allow for me to ask questions, which I think she was grateful for. We came to the great double doors of the hall, which were open, and through which I could see the assembled court, perhaps 50 senior advisors, 2 ranks of court officers, the compact senior delegate Vermin Aris in his formal gray, and at the far end of the hall the dais, and on the dais the queen. I had seen Queen Savine Velaroth at 2 ceremonial events in 4 years. I had never been spoken to by her. She was a tall woman in her early 50s by Velaroth reckoning, dressed today in the formal deep violet robe with the silver thread collar of the high mourning that the Velaroth wear when a formal death record is to be entered into the annals. Her hair was dark, threaded with copper, in the court braid. Her eyes were the deep amber color of the older Velaroth aristocracy, not violet, despite what the popular fictions claim about Velaroth royalty, but a clear deep amber that catches the light. She was standing, the hall was standing, the court was waiting. The attendant led the child to a small carved stool at the foot of the dais. The child sat. The attendant retreated. The Chamberlain, Preen Velsorvath, an older man with gray-silver hair and the 4-fold rank insignia at his collar, turned to the compact delegate and gestured. Then he looked over and saw me at the back of the hall, and his face did something complicated. He came to me. He spoke very quietly. He said, "Officer Reth, there has been an error in the scheduling. Your renewal appointment was moved into the court session because the court session was originally scheduled in the Chamberlain's office and the office was reassigned. You were not removed from the queue. I apologize. The session is the formal entry of the consort's death record into the permanent annals, and your renewal will be processed afterward. Please take a seat in the visitors' row." He pointed. I went. The visitors' row was a single row of carved stone benches against the eastern wall of the hall, perhaps 20 meters from the dais. I sat down. I placed my notepad on my knee, closed. I did not open it. The chamberlain returned to his position. The compact delegate Vermin Aris, whom I knew slightly and respected, stepped forward and unrolled a formal scroll. He read, in compact standard with the Velaroth ceremonial inflections, the formal motion to enter Velsorvain Aaron, consort of Queen Savine Velaroth and father of the heir Ilivith, into the permanent annals as deceased 2 years and 7 months prior in a survey accident in the Velmersh Canyon. He read the supporting documentation. He read the procedural finding. He read the request that the heir, as the surviving issue, witness the entry. The hall was very quiet. The chamberlain stepped forward. He said in the formal Velaroth, "Does the heir witness?" This is the part of the ceremony I would later learn about. The heir is required to come forward, touch the scroll, and speak the formal phrase, 3 words in Old Velaroth, that constitutes the witnessing. It is the moment at which a child of royal lineage formally acknowledges the loss of a parent and the irrevocability of the annal entry. It is the moment at which the death becomes legal. The Princess Ilivith did not come forward. She sat on her small stool. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her slate was on her knee. She was looking at the floor. The chamberlain waited. The court waited. The queen on the dais did not move. I would learn later that the formal ceremony allows the heir to take her time. There is no protocol urgency. There is no required moment. We waited. I sat in the visitors' row with my notepad on my knee and watched the small dark-haired child on the carved stool at the foot of the dais. And I felt. I am not a man given to feeling things sharply in formal situations, but I felt the weight of 2 years pressing down on her small folded hands. She lifted her head. She did not look at her mother. She did not look at the chamberlain. She did not look at the compact delegate or the scroll. She turned her head toward the eastern wall of the hall. Her eyes found me on the visitors' row. She looked at me for perhaps 3 seconds. Then she turned her head back to the dais, and she looked up at her mother, the queen, and she lifted one small hand and pointed back toward me, and in a voice that was very small but very clear, a child's voice, the unmistakable voice of a 4.5-year-old who has not spoken in public for 2 years, she said, in compact standard, with a long ellipsis pause between the 2 clauses. "Mom, that's the human." The hall fell silent. It is hard to describe the silence that follows a sentence like that, spoken in a hall like that by a child like that, after a silence like the one she had been carrying. The hall did not gasp. The hall did not murmur. The hall went into the kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the active presence of 50 trained court officers and senior advisors collectively understanding that something has happened that none of them have a procedure for. I sat in the visitors' row with my notepad on my knee. I did not understand what had just happened. I had a vague impression that the child had named me, had identified me as a person of significance in some way, but I could not see how, and I could not see why, and I could not see what the response was supposed to be. The queen put her hand to her mouth. It was a small, controlled gesture. She did not cry out. She did not sit down. She put her hand to her mouth and held it there for perhaps 4 seconds. Her eyes were very wet. She was looking at her daughter. The chamberlain looked at the queen. The queen lowered her hand. She said something to the chamberlain in Old Velaroth, a phrase I did not catch. The chamberlain's face went still in a particular way I had seen, in 4 years, on perhaps 2 faces. The way the face of a senior court officer goes when he has just been asked to do a thing he has not been asked to do in his career. He bowed. He stepped back. The queen stepped down from the dais. I watched her come. She came down the 3 steps of the dais slowly in the formal court walk, her violet robe trailing behind her. She walked past the chamberlain. She walked past the compact delegate Vermin Aris, who did not move. She walked past the first rank of court officers, who turned where they stood without speaking. She walked past the second rank. She walked past the senior advisors. She walked the length of the hall, perhaps 20 meters, and she came to stand in front of me at the visitors' row. I stood up. I did not know what to do. I stood up because she was standing and I was sitting, and that seemed wrong. I held my notepad in my left hand. My right hand was at my side. Queen Savine Velaroth looked at me. Her face was composed in the way faces are composed when the person behind them is not composed and has trained for 50 years to manage the discrepancy. Her amber eyes were very wet, but no tear fell. She said in compact standard, very quietly, quietly enough that the hall had to strain to hear, although the silence carried her voice the full length of it. Officer Reth, my daughter has named you her Cariath. Will you accept the role? I had no idea what the role was. I said, Your Majesty, I am honored. I do not know what the role is. May I ask? She did not look impatient. She did not look insulted. She looked for a moment as though my admission of not knowing had been the small additional confirmation that she had needed. She said, still very quietly, The Cariath is the formal witness of the heir. It is a tradition that predates the unification of the houses. It is the heir's choosing, never the mother's, never the court's, never the chamberlain's. The Cariath is the one the heir will hear when she is finally ready to speak. The role is permanent. It cannot be undone. The Cariath travels with the heir until she is of age and continues, by tradition, to be her witness in all formal proceedings for the remainder of his life. He has no political authority. He has no court rank. He has no salary other than a small lifetime stipend. His role is to sit when she is silent, to stand when she is afraid, and to speak plainly in court when she needs the truth said by a person who has nothing to lose. The role has been vacant in this family for 16 years. My own mother declined to honor the tradition when I was of age. I had thought it would not be honored for my daughter. She paused. She said, She has named you. I am required by tradition to ask. You are required by no tradition to accept. I stood in the visitors' row with my notepad in my left hand and looked at the Queen of Velaroth Prime. I said, Your Majesty, I do not know what I am being asked to be, but if it is a request that I sit on a bench when your daughter is silent and stand near her when she is afraid and speak plainly when she asks me to, then yes, I accept. The Queen closed her eyes for the space of one breath. When she opened them, she said, Then you are her Cariath. She turned and she walked back down the length of the hall. I sat down. I did not know what else to do. I sat down on the visitor's bench with my notepad in my hand. I watched the Queen return to the dais. I watched her go to her daughter. I watched her kneel in the formal violet robe. The Queen kneels for no one but her own child, and only on certain ceremonies, and gather the child into her arms, and the child put her small dark head against her mother's shoulder and finally, quietly, began to cry. She had not cried in 2 years. She cried for perhaps a minute. The Chamberlain Preen Velsorvath stepped forward. He said in Old Velaroth the formal closing phrase. The hall murmured the response. The court session was, by every formal measure, ended without the heir's witness of the death record. The annals would not be updated that day. I sat on the visitor's bench. I sat there for perhaps another 20 minutes while the hall slowly emptied. The compact delegate Vermin Aris came over and shook my hand without speaking. The chamberlain came over and bowed and said, in compact standard, Cariath. Then he, too, withdrew. It was the attendant in dark blue who came and sat down beside me eventually, when the hall was almost empty. She said, Officer Reth, the Chamberlain's office will brief you on the role this evening. The princess will wish to see you tomorrow morning. Her tutor will arrange the meeting. Is there anything you need to ask now? I said, I need to ask one thing. I do not understand what just happened. Why did she choose me? The attendant looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, did you sit on a bench in the antechamber and not perform? I said, yes. She said, did a man speak unkindly in her presence? I said, yes. She said, and what did you do? I said, I asked him to take the conversation to the corridor. She nodded slowly. And did you ask the princess anything about herself? I said, no, I did not want to make her feel watched. The attendant said, then you have answered your own question. The Cariath is chosen by the heir's Velarath, the inner self-sense that develops early in royal children and is sometimes precocious in heirs whose Velarath has been awake longer than is comfortable. The Velarath does not look for kindness exactly. It looks for Velarath Shen, the sustained, dignified inner stillness. Most adults the princess meets are performing for her. You did not perform. You did the things that Velarath Shen does. You sat. You worked. You spoke when speech was required. You let her bench be her bench. She has been waiting for 2 years for someone to do that in the same room as her without knowing she was watching. I said, she has been waiting. The attendant said, she is the heir of the Velarath. Her Velarath was awake at 3. It told her that her father was not coming back before anyone else knew. It told her that the man she was waiting for would arrive when she was 4.5. It told her that he would be a stranger, and that he would not know what he had done. I said, and the drawing she showed me, the deep place with a person drawing, was it her father? The attendant looked at me. She said, it was you. She drew it 3 days ago. She has been drawing it for 3 weeks. The chamberlain only learned of it last night when her tutor brought it to him. The court was unsure whether to take it seriously. The court has now taken it seriously. I said, but she had not met me 3 weeks ago. The attendant said, the Velarath is what it is, Officer Reth. We do not explain it, we honor it. Her father, her real father, Velsorvain Aaron, was a sketcher. He kept architectural notebooks. He used to sit on the south bench of the antechamber and sketch the carved frieze in the late afternoons before court sessions. The princess sat with him there from the time she could walk. When you sat on that bench this afternoon and drew the corbel detail of the eastern doorway, you were doing what her father did in the place where he did it, in the precise composed way he did it. She did not mistake you for him. The Velarath does not mistake people. It recognizes qualities. She recognized that the quality which her father had, the quiet, sustained, dignified attention, was present in you. And she named you because the tradition requires the heir to name her Cariath, and the tradition requires the Cariath to be the person who carries that quality. She has been waiting for you. I sat on the visitor's bench with my notepad in my hand and looked at the empty hall of witnessing. I said, I'm not a man of significance. I am a cultural exchange attaché, grade 3. I sketch lintels for my sister. I am 40 years old and I have never been the kind of person who is asked to be the witness of anything. The attendant said, yes, that is part of why she named you. The Cariath cannot be a person of court significance. The Cariath cannot have political weight. The Cariath must have nothing to lose. That is why the tradition requires the heir to name a stranger. Your insignificance, forgive me, Officer Reth, is the precondition. You are now the most reliable person in the Velarath sovereign court. The tradition assumes that a person who has nothing to gain will tell the truth. I said, but I have a posting. I have a family, I have a sister. Attendant said, your posting will be transferred to a permanent appointment within the palace. Your family will be invited to visit at sovereign expense. Your sister will be invited to study the palace lintels, which she will find very interesting. The compact has already, in the 4 years of your posting, registered you as low mobility on its administrative records, which means there is no urgent reassignment pending. The chamberlain will brief you tonight. The role is permanent, but it is not onerous. It is mostly sitting on benches and being where the princess can find you. You will continue to draw lintels. You will continue to write reports nobody reads. The only difference is that every now and then the princess will look across a room at you and you will look back, and she will know that you are there, and that will be enough. I sat on the visitor's bench. I said, all right. That was the day I became Karyath to the heir of the Velaroth. The chamberlain briefed me that evening in his office, in the careful patient register a senior court officer uses when he is teaching a man a tradition that man is now responsible for honoring. He gave me a small leather-bound volume, the Karyath's Manual, a slim book of perhaps 80 pages, written 400 years ago and updated rarely. He told me what the role required and what it did not require. He told me what would be expected at the formal proceedings and what would be expected in private. He told me, with the small, dry warmth of a man who had not expected to brief a Karyath in his lifetime, that the role was simpler than it sounded. He said, Officer Reth, you will sit, you will stand, you will speak when she asks, and you will not perform. You have demonstrated already that you know how to do all four. The rest is a matter of being where she can find you. He also told me, more quietly, that the Queen had requested I take dinner with her that evening in the private dining chamber. I went. The Queen and I ate a quiet meal of cold root soup and a Velaroth grain bread that I had eaten only once before at a formal reception. She asked me about my sister. I told her about Een and her work on the proportions of formal architecture. The Queen listened. She asked me about my mother, who was then alive. I told her about my mother. She asked me about the lintels I had photographed in the corridors of the palace. I described them. We ate in the manner of two adults who have nothing to negotiate and who are taking the measure of each other through the small information. Toward the end of the meal she said, Officer Reth, the Karyath was not a role I had planned for. My daughter has been waiting longer than I knew. I am grateful that you accepted. I am also grateful that you did not pretend to understand what you were accepting. The pretending would have been the disqualifying thing. I said, I do not think I am the kind of man who pretends, Your Majesty. I do not have the energy for it. She smiled the first time I had ever seen her smile in 4 years on the posting. It was a small smile, but it was the real thing. She said, that is also a quality of Velarathshin, Officer Reth. The Karyath's Manual will tell you so on page 11 if you read it, which I am sure you will. I met the princess the next morning in the small east garden, where her tutor Mela Velsorin had set up a low table with 2 cups of warmed grain drink and a small bowl of dried fruit. The princess was sitting on a stone bench. She had her slate. I sat at a respectful distance on the bench across from her, the way I had the day before. She did not speak. I did not speak. We sat for perhaps an hour. Mela in the doorway behind us did not interrupt. At one point the princess held up her slate. She had drawn the carved frieze above the east garden door. I told her it was a good drawing. She nodded. We sat for a while longer. Then she stood and she walked over and she sat on the bench beside me, perhaps a half-meter away, and she put her small hand on my forearm for the space of 3 seconds, and then she removed it, and she went back to her own bench. I have understood in the 23 years since that this was the formal Karyath acceptance gesture from her side, the half-meter, the 3-second hand. The Chamberlain's Manual mentioned it, on page 19. The princess had read the manual already by then, of course. She had been preparing for the role of namer for 2 years. I am now 63 years old. The Princess Iliveth Velaroth is 28. She was confirmed as Queen-in-Waiting on her 7th-year ceremony, the formal Velaroth coming of the Velarath ceremony at age 7. And at that ceremony, which was attended by the full assembled court of 300 and the diplomatic delegations of 17 compact and non-compact polities, she spoke at length in public for the first time. She was, by then, no longer mute. She had begun speaking again at 5½, slowly at first, mostly in private conversations with her mother and her tutor and me. By 7, she could read aloud in the formal Velaroth, and could conduct a short conversation in compact standard with a visiting dignitary, which was the threshold the ceremony required. She gave her address from the small carved platform that the heirs of the Velaroth give their seventh-year addresses from. She wore the deep violet robe of the heir, with the small silver thread collar that marks the 7 completed years. She stood very still. She looked out across the assembled court. She looked at her mother, on the dais behind her, who was holding herself composed in the way the Velaroth queens have held themselves composed for 900 years. She looked at the diplomatic delegations. She looked at the senior advisors. Then she found me, in the visitors' row at the eastern wall, where I had sat for 2.5 years by then, and her eyes rested on me for perhaps 3 seconds. Then she turned back to the assembled court, and her first words at her own 7th-year ceremony were, "My Cariath is Dove-and-Reth, who sat on a bench when I was 4 and did not perform." The hall, which had been quiet, became more quiet. She continued with her address. She spoke for 11 minutes in the formal Velaroth. She spoke about her father, whom she remembered, and whose loss she carried but no longer carried in silence. She spoke about her mother, whom she loved. She spoke about the houses which she had been studying. She spoke about the Velmersh Canyon, which she had visited the previous summer with me and her tutor and a small party of escorts, and which she had stood at the edge of and looked into, and which she had said, after a long quiet moment, was a place where the violet was the color it should be and where she would visit again when she was older. She spoke about the Cariath tradition, and why it mattered, and why she had named the man she had named. She named me 3 times in her address. Each time she said my full name, Dove-and-Reth, and each time she said it with the particular emphasis the Velaroth give to names of significance, where the first syllable is held a fraction longer than the second. I sat in the visitors' row with my notepad on my knee, the same notepad, replaced every 2 years with the same brand, which I had used since the first afternoon, and I listened to a 7-year-old princess of an alien royal house name me in front of 300 witnesses, and I understood, finally, what the attendant had told me in the empty hall of witnessing 23 years ago. I had not been chosen for what I was. I had been chosen for what I was not. I was not glamorous, not powerful, not ambitious, not performing. I was a man who sat on benches and sketched the corbel detail and asked an advisor politely to take a contemptuous conversation into the corridor. I was a man whose sister thought transoms were underrated. I was a man who, when a small girl held up a slate with a drawing on it, had asked her what it was instead of looking at her mother or her attendants for permission. That had been enough. I have spent 23 years now in the role of Cariath to the heir of the Velaroth sovereign court. I attend the formal proceedings. I sit in the visitors' row. I have spoken in court 4 times in 23 years, each time at the princess's request, each time briefly, each time in plain, compact standard rendering of a small specific truth she wanted said by a person who had no court rank. I have drawn perhaps 1,000 more lintels. My sister Ian came to visit in the 2nd year and stayed for 6 weeks studying the palace. She has come back 4 times since. My mother visited once before she died. She met the princess, and the princess took her hand and called her by her given name, and my mother said afterward that she had never been called by her given name by a member of any royalty anywhere, and that it had been the kindest thing. The princess is 28 now. She will be confirmed as the Queen of Velaroth Prime in 2 years, at her 30th year ceremony, which is the Velaroth threshold of full sovereignty. I will be 65. I will continue in the role of Cariath. By tradition, the Cariath remains the witness of the sovereign for the remainder of his life. I will sit in the visitors' row at her court sessions for as long as I can sit. When I can no longer sit, the role will not pass to another. The Cariath cannot be replaced. When I die, the role will simply end as the tradition allows, and the princess, by then the queen, will hold the silence of an unfilled Cariath chair on her court days, which is a kind of mourning the Velaroth recognize and which she will, I am told, manage with the composure that her mother managed grief with. I do not know what I did to deserve any of this. I have asked the princess twice, once at her 18th year reception, once at the small private dinner the night before her formal coronation announcement last winter. Both times she has answered the same way. She has said, "You sat on a bench, Cariath. You did the thing my father used to do in the place he used to do it, and you did not know that you were doing it." The Velarath does not require knowing. It requires being. You were being what I needed someone to be in the room where I was waiting for them. The room remembered. I remembered. That is all. That is, I think, the most precise way the thing can be said. I will close with one small image, which I have kept in my notepad for 23 years, and which I sometimes look at on the long afternoons when there is no court session and no scheduled appearance, and I am simply, as I have always been, sitting on a bench in the southern antechamber waiting for a princess who is no longer a child but who still comes by, sometimes, after the day's formal sessions, to sit a little while in the place where the carved frieze of the waterleaf motif is overhead, and the late light of Velaroth Prime comes in violet through the high windows. The image is the slate she drew that afternoon, which her tutor Mela Velsarin rescued from the antechamber after the court session, and which the princess gave to me, formally, at her 8th-year birthday, in a small ceremony attended only by her mother and her tutor and me. The slate is small and dark, and the mineral chalk has faded slightly but is still legible. There is a long vertical line going from the top to the bottom, the deep violet color of the Velmersh basin. There is a small stick figure 2/3 of the way down. The figure has no face. It has 2 arms. One arm is raised, holding a small rectangle. From the rectangle come small wavy lines, which I now know are the marks of a pencil sketching the corbel detail of an eastern doorway. The figure is me. The princess had drawn me, 3 weeks before I sat down on the bench across from her, in a posture I would later assume without knowing I had been expected. I have not asked her how the Velarath does that. I have stopped asking. She told me once when she was 9 that the Velarath does not know the future. It knows the shape of what is needed and waits for the shape to walk into the room. The shape that walked into the room that afternoon was a 40-year-old cultural exchange attaché with a notepad and a sister who thought transoms were underrated. I sat on a bench and I did not perform. That was the whole of it. The rest is a quiet life in the visitors' row at the eastern wall of the Hall of Witnessing, and a princess who, every now and then, looks across the room at me. I look back, she knows I am there. That has been enough.